This is David Bernstein. I'm President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this webinar. JCPA is the network hub of 125 JCRCs and 16 national organizations. We advocate on issues of concern to the Jewish community, such as civil rights, anti-Semitism, and Israel's quest for peace and security. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation with Jonathan Tobin, who is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS. Jonathan and I had a fascinating exchange in the form of an op-ed that you might have read, and we will, you can see it. It's called "The Jewish Community Relations Trap and Exchange." It was based on a column that Jonathan had written a couple weeks before, in which he questioned certain approaches that the Jewish community relations field has been using in engaging others, and we're going to talk about some of those issues. We had a chance to feel each other out in writing, and Jonathan, I really appreciate you doing this and for the opportunity to dialogue.
Well, thanks for having me on, David. It's a pleasure, and good afternoon to all of our audience, and looking forward to hearing from David, as well as getting some questions from our viewers.
Yes, so please do put your questions in the question box, and we'll do our best to monitor them as we go along, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We got a lot of people today, so it's wonderful. So Jonathan, one of the issues that we started our discussion with was on whether or not to forgive anti-Semites and to give them to cut them a break. And even the title of this seemed to garner a lot of strong feelings. I mean, I got a lot of people saying, no, don't cut them a break. Don't forgive anti-Semites under any circumstances. But, you know, we saw some very high-profile cases of this in the last few weeks. There were a couple African-American celebrities, one athlete who made some anti-Semitic comments, and then there were Jews who reached out to them. And a couple cases, including one surprising case where Mort Klein reached out to Ice Cube and got him to sing a different tune. We saw them change their tune. And you seem to suggest in your first column that that was a problem. And I really wanted to ask you what your thoughts are now. We had Nick Cannon especially came on an AJC webcast recently and talked about his own journey, recent journey on anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, I think that, you know, we should avoid hard absolutes. I mean, there's no such, you know, in journalism, we never say never. And when we speak of anti-Semites and people who say things that cause great offense and should cause offense, and how do we react to them? Now, there may well be, you know, there are a number of examples, and certainly, you know, with the fellow you just mentioned, who was on your podcast and is now basically all over, quoting Barry Weiss. He seems to have had some sort of, you know, sort of road to Damascus moment. And I'm not going to sit here because I don't know him and question it. I think those of us who have been following these kinds of issues for a lot longer than the last few weeks understand that often there is a dynamic with individuals who do stuff like this, who get in trouble, and then they look to find ways to dig themselves out. I'm not opposed in principle to giving them, you know, a ladder to climb out of the hole in which they've dug. But I also think that we have to be not so much careful, but a little, you know, a little journalistic cynicism when people are doing things to try and save their careers is warranted. I think some of these cases are a bit odd, and some of the conversions, you know, it's like, dial back in 6 months or a year from now. What tune will they be singing then? I think there are broader issues, however. And, you know, it's a lot. I'm not that interested in Deshaun Jackson, the Philadelphia Eagles player, or any of these individuals per se, or even Ice Cube, who suddenly is besties with Mort Klein, of all people. As you say, that's a rather odd thing. And now there's an argument between Mort Klein and Shmuley Boteach, who attacked him in the Allgemeiner, and Mort's all upset about that. These are minor issues. The real issue is, what do we as a community, what do those of us who are either empowered as heads of organizations, or those of us who speak publicly in Jewish forums, as I do, what do we do to deal with anti-Semitism? And at what point, you know, what lines do we draw? And the point is, we all draw lines. we all know that there's some things that are so deep and so indicative of deep prejudice and really toxic notions that have gotten into our public square, that we need more than just a personal meeting and as our Christians would say, a come to Jesus moment. It's got to be something a little more serious. And when I wrote that column, The Community Relations Trap, what I was trying to get at was that those of you who are in the community relations field, and really all of us, even those of us who are in Jewish journalism, we're all in community relations in one way or another. We have to adjust our paradigm to deal with different challenges. And I think, I'll raise it, but we can talk about it more. And I'll just introduce it in a way to show how times have changed. There was the instance in Philadelphia where the president of the Philadelphia chapter of the NAACP, the most venerable of civil rights organizations, put a Facebook post that was not merely anti-Semitic, but straight out of the Nazi playbook. Everybody understands that. And this was so shocking. And then the NAACP sort of waited, as if you follow this, I live in the Philadelphia area, and if you read the African-American newspaper, there were leaders of the NAACP, member of the local board, looking to the national board for guidance and not getting it. The NAACP national organization was silent for weeks, and they finally issued a condemnation, but didn't cut ties, didn't call for the firing. And I raise this to talk about how things can change, is that 20 years ago, and I didn't remember this, I didn't know this, 20 years ago, in 2000, there was another instance where an NAACP chapter president, a man named Lee Alcorn in Dallas, also gave a terrible anti-Semitic statement. In fact, it was, it's timely because he condemned Al Gore's pick of Joe Lieberman as the Democratic vice presidential pick, because we shouldn't have a Jew person. And because Jews are only about money, and just really nasty stuff. Now, Kwesi Mfume, who was the former congressman who was then the president of the NAACP, wasted no time. I mean, within hours, he issued a statement condemning him, firing him, basically don't show up at any of our organizational events again. You're done. That didn't happen this time. It's worth asking why, and it's worth asking how this affects our efforts at community relations.
Right. I want to get to that. We'll go deeper into the NAACP case study here, but before we move on from celebrities, or people who are prominent who make anti-Semitic comments who then try to step down from it. And I think the NAACP example might be a little bit different here. Isn't there a value, though? Don't we send a sort of a powerful message? In the case of Nick Cannon, for example, he has 4.8 million followers on Twitter. He's got a radio show. He's on TV. He's a major cultural figure. And even if in the heart of hearts, he still feels the same. And I don't see why we shouldn't believe him in this situation. Some people are more believable than others. Isn't there a value in actually having that same person use that same platform to step off the brink and to say, I do not believe that anymore, and I'm sorry I did that? Aren't we in a way sending a much better message about anti-Semitism that way than if we were just to hold them in perpetual contempt?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Is it better that he is tweeting out to his millions of followers quotes from Barry Weiss than quotes from Louis Farrakhan? Sure, I mean, of course. That, it would be silly to argue otherwise. It's like all, it's like as lawyers say, hard cases make bad law. It's a very extreme example. What Dick Cannon has done is gone from, he's gone like 180. I mean, he's gone from tweeting anti-Semitism to all of a sudden claiming Jewish ancestors, and he's like an adopted member of the tribe. It's hard to know what to make of it. It's an odd story. I look forward to some enterprising journalists getting deeper on it. But you go to an interesting point, and in years past, and both of us are old enough to know that these issues have not just come up recently. It was one of Abe Foxman, the former director of the ADL. One of his specialties was to basically be the rabbi for famous people, famous people who said terrible things about the Jews, to then go to him and sort of seek absolution. And he was kind of like our medieval pope selling indulgences at times. And sometimes it was right on target and was very productive, and sometimes it was a little silly. Sometimes I saw it, and it seemed like, whose interests are being served here. I don't know that the Jewish communities are, but of course there are no absolutes here. We don't say we will never make one bad tweet, we'll never forgive you. I'll give you an example, a political example, and I know we're not here to, neither am I, to talk, to endorse or against candidates. When Representative Ilhan Omar made some anti-Semitic tweets, then there was a question, well, if she's going to apologize for it, as she sort of did over time, is that enough? My answer to that is, if that's all there was to it, a straight tweet, sure, that would have been enough. Right. But if she's also a BDS supporter, if this is a consistent pattern, then I'm not that interested in her apologies. So right. that's the way I judge it. And I guess where I started out and where our kind of argument lay, it comes up, is that I know that much of the organized Jewish world is, and for very good reasons, sort of temperamentally always oriented towards making allies, making friends, not drawing lines in the sands, always the door is open. And of course we do that because we're a minority community, we need allies. That's the whole point of community relations. And I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is, sometimes when times change and the people that are interlocutors are not the partners that we might have had 20 years ago, who are people who really are sharing the same values and who are, real allies, as opposed to people who may really just be BDS supporters, we have to be much warier of our instincts to always.
I want to go there too, but just one last thought. And actually, a question came out that was almost exactly what it was going to be my next point. It's really this, that, at a time when we're seeing so much cancel culture, and maybe we even agree on that one, that's not a good thing. Shouldn't the Jewish community try to model the opposite? Shouldn't we be able to say, we're going to project a much more humane approach? We're going to, maybe not to repeat offenders. There's a point after which you no longer have standing, but until that point, we're going to give you every chance to step away from it, because we want to model a different kind of society, a different kind of culture than cancel culture.
I think that's a fair point, but let me, my problem with cancel culture is not merely the say something bad and you're done forever, which is not a healthy atmosphere, especially when it's basically crowdsourced. It's digging into people's, what tweets that they may have done as teenagers, misinterpreting things, twisting things. My problem with cancel culture is that it is at its heart about silencing opposing opinions, about creating uniformity and opposing heterodoxy, which is something that Barry Weiss was getting at in that whole controversy of the New York Times. That's what's toxic about cancel culture. It doesn't mean we have to just say, well, you said something bad, so what? We forgive you, blah, blah, blah. It's about something much more insidious. Now, of course, we should model a willingness to listen to people when they're genuine, when they understand that what they've done, and the door is always open to repentance. I mean, that's the gates. We're not that far away from the days of awe. It's just the Yom Tovim are just around the corner. We don't shut the gates. We are willing to listen. However, we also have to understand that there are deeper issues here, and that when we are confronted with trends and even groups that are clearly not merely not in the interests of the Jewish community, but not in the interests of having a public square devoid of hate, and we have to really take it much more seriously. And that's why when people quote Farrakhan, our radar goes up, not just because they said a bad thing. All of us can say bad things. You can always, sort of go through and try and find something that you can either twist out of context. But when you are treating one of the nation's leading hate mongers as as a reliable source, as someone who is admirable and whom you treat as, a regular, as a person to be respected, rather than the moral equivalent of David Duke. We have to view it a little differently. We have to understand that the problem here isn't just a straight quote.
Right, and we'll get to that, and also with the case of Rodney Mohammed in Philadelphia. But let's go to this other area that we've been talking about and you've raised so far, which is really like, when is it that we draw the line? I thought I would quote my mother here. My mother wrote me about this.
Always a good thing. Yes.
Right. My mom, who's watching, if she got the technology down, is a Jew from Baghdad, Iraq. She left Iraq in 1963, and she's not known for her liberal views, and probably agrees with you more often than she agrees with me. But she actually did agree with me in this exchange of views that we had. And one of the reasons is that she was a very small minority, especially after most of the Jews left and her family remained, in a country that rife with hostility. And and she'll tell the story of people who made, not knowing she was a Jew, anti-Semitic comments, and how in her her work with them over time, she was able to turn them around. And I've heard others talk about this as well. People have gone to the military and met with people who thought they were, that Jews had horns and so forth. And it's not just a matter of them getting to know the person. It's really also about a question of power. And this is really what I want to get at. Just as you critique the community relations field for being too quick to engage, and perhaps engage at the price of legitimizing people, and there are times when I would agree with that, by the way. I'm not saying we should engage with everyone. I'm critical of those who say we shouldn't engage, because by not engaging and by just condemning and hoping that we marginalize, that we're actually not condemning, we're not actually marginalizing anyone. In other words, we're actually overstating our power to be able to marginalize people. And that we think we're marginalizing, we think we're actually fighting anti-Semitism, we do it. We condemn in the strongest possible terms statement acts, and we will never step foot in the same building as that person ever again. But actually, we're not doing anything. In fact, if others in society do not recognize the anti-Semitism, we may actually isolate ourselves in the process. And I can think of many examples where we may have done that, where we're trying so hard to sideline somebody, and what in effect we do is sideline ourselves, because that person is not recognized for their anti-Semitism. And in those situations, I'm wondering if we need a different approach. Just because we insist that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, and we're so adamant about this, and we put it in a definition that we're sharing around the world, doesn't mean that we've won the fight. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees with us. And sometimes if we insist that, others might say, well, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that, and I'm going to continue to allow this person to be on my board or speak at my event and so forth. And so my question is, do we need another strategy that might deal with that? As I argued in our piece, one strategy is condemn and marginalize. That's the traditional strategy. And believe me, even though I've been in the community relations field for my life, I've probably done more condemning than a lot of people have. I mean, we spend most of our time condemning, right? But as especially with the emergence of progressive anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism, feeling that that's not working very well, we've started to adopt an alternative strategy, not instead of, but in addition to, which I like to call engage and influence. And it's not necessarily engaging the hardcore anti-Semite Farrakhan supporter Tamika Mallory herself, right? But it's to engage people in the person's proximity. It's to say there are people who don't yet share her view that we can influence, but the only way we can influence them is by being in the proximity of Tamika Mallory or other people who might hold anti-Semitic views. And I think that's actually an effective way of moving them away and protecting ourselves over time. Do you disagree with me?
I think that sounds very logical, and in many cases, I probably would agree with you about using that tactic. The question is when and where, and how. We run, when we deal in absolutes, it becomes very difficult to make intelligent decisions. The truth is, of course, our goal should not merely be to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, everybody agree with us, or otherwise shut up. our goal must be to persuade. I mean, I try to practice this in my own work, is that whenever I touch on that subject, I explain why it is, why that's true. I don't just state it. You know, good opinion journalism is argument, not assertion. And that's the same thing with community relations work. We have to be always oriented towards persuading, not merely, you know, issuing diktat. So of course I agree with that. And yes, there are times when we should engage and we should talk to people who we think can be persuaded and work with them whenever possible. The question is, where do you draw the line? At what point do you say, okay, you know, we're invested in persuading this person. This person isn't listening. We're not making any. We're not making. You know, we're not making up any ground. We're just legitimizing them. They're saying, well, listen, you know, I'm friends with. I'm in dialogue with. How can you accuse me of doing, you know, or saying something bad? So we have to pick our shots. We have to say where it is. We have to state our principles. In our piece, I said this, and you were kind of saying, well, this is an old paradigm, but you know, I'll state it again. We always have to be wary of dialogue that consists of someone, say, for example, complaining about Israel, talking about all of Israel's sins. I mean, I've heard this, I've seen this as a journalist, and then the Jews who are so committed to dialogue, basically just agreeing with them and saying, yes, you're right, that's terrible, you know, we're working on it. And I was like, that's not dialogue. That's just, you know, that's just agreeing with the other side.
There's no question that happens. There's no question that happens, but that's not the whole story. I mean, some of the work that we do is advocacy oriented as well. It's, you know, we're entering a coalition to deal with X, and in dealing with that, we're coming to the tables with some actors who you might deem unsavory or problematic, but it means being able to influence larger discussion and knowing that if we weren't there, we would be making place for somebody else who's going to have a very different attitude than we do about these issues.
I totally get that. The question is the where and the when. I would not tell you that it would always be wrong to do that, because I know that's not true. But I will tell you that I'm pretty sure that there are times when it would be wrong to do that. When, you know, going to that table to not be a strong and active player, but just to be, you know, the caboose in an organization or coalition that has absolutely no interest in listening to the pleas of the Jewish community or trying to be sensitive to the pleas of the Jewish community, and just is using, you know, you talk about left-wing anti-Zion, using liberal Jewish groups as cover, you know, where liberal Jewish organizations basically become the beard for anti-Semites. That has happened. I'm not saying it always happens, and I know most of the, you know, the people in the community relations field don't want to do that. But, you know,
I'm actually not sure that
about the community relations council. This is about the vast number of Jewish organizations, left, right, and right-wing groups can be compromised too. Let's be clear about that. You know, you pick a side. We're in a bifurcated political culture right now. We're a nation of two warring tribes that don't read, you know, don't listen, watch, or read the same media. People pick sides and they decide if you're on the side, if the defining issue is President Trump or the defining issue is something else, if you're on my side, you're okay, or I'm not going to condemn you. It's sort of like in the 1930s, the Popular Front, no enemies on the left or no enemies on the right. We should never have that kind of policy. And that's something we should, both in journalism and the community relations field, always guard against and always be warning against.
Right. But someone asked if we should, if this is being, if they can record it. It is being recorded, and we will share the recording publicly.
It's all on the record. I'm a journalist, so
it's all on the record, right? So we started talking about the case of Rodney Mohammed, the head of the NAACP in Philadelphia, who posted an anti-Semitic meme. He later, I don't know, apologized, but clarified might be the wrong term. We waited for a while for the national NAACP, and you know, JCPA has a relationship, actually quite close relationship with the national NAACP. We reached out to them, asked them to what their intentions were. We didn't hear back for a while. We did, in the end, they did condemn the statements. They were saddened and deeply disappointed by the harm caused by Mr. Mohammed's actions. They also said that he now recognizes the offensive nature of the imagery and post. They did not ask him to resign, and there may be more to this story than either of us knows. Organizations are complicated, including Jewish organizations, by the way, that can't always wave a magic wand and get somebody to resign either because of our own procedures. What do you think groups like mine should do with the National NAACP? They've been a venerable partner, as you said yourself, for many years. The CEO of the NAACP came on a webinar just like this one, addressed 2,000 people on it, and talked about anti-Semitism in no uncertain terms. And they certainly understand the intersection between racism and anti-Semitism. Do you think we should take some kind of punitive action against the NAACP at this point?
Listen, I think we have to dig one layer deeper to understand this controversy. If I can sort of back us up from your question, which I'll get to,
Sure.
You have to understand who Rodney Mohammed is. And that illustrates the whole problem that we're discussing in large. It's not just micro, it's macro. Rodney Mohammed isn't just, a local African-American leader. He's the minister of a Nation of Islam mosque number 12 in North Philadelphia, not all that far from where I'm actually speaking to you from. The Nation of Islam is the sect led by Louis Farrakhan. Rodney Mohammed is a supporter of Louis Farrakhan. The Nation of Islam, we don't want to, basically its core beliefs are a mix of conspiracy theories and racial incitement that no one, that is just indefensible. It is a remarkable thing that a Nation of Islam minister is an NAACP chapter president. I think that would have been in an earlier era unthinkable.
But they're elected, though, by the way, locally.
Yeah.
They're not appointed by their national organization. They're elected.
Yes, he was elected by the local group. Absolutely. That the NAACP, has always been like that. It has had independent chapters, but the fact is the nation, and this goes to what we were just discussing a moment ago. It is clear to us, I think it's clear to liberals, conservatives, most people in the mainstream of America, that the Nation of Islam is not just another faith group. It is a very toxic organization led by a person who is one of the nation's leading hate mongers. He's the moral equivalent of David Duke. I'll stake my right. I don't think that's arguable. And yet, within parts of the African American community, the Nation of Islam is seen as being about empowerment. It's being about speaking up for Black people. It is not seen as hate mongers. And that's a really hard argument for us, as members of communities. How do you deal with that? You're being led by someone who's part of an organization. It's kind of like saying, well, this guy is okay. I know he's the local Klan wizard, but he's a nice guy and we all like him. And indeed, Rodney Mohammed is well respected in Philadelphia. He's a political operative. He was a paid political consultant for Mayor Jim Kenney during his re-election campaign last year. I mean, he's got more pull in Philadelphia than either of us. So it is a really problematic thing. So on the one hand, right, it is totally unsurprising that he would post an anti-Semitic thing on Facebook, a vile, sort of Hitlerish post. And, why would we be surprised that a Nation of Islam minister would do that? And yet we're stuck with how do we react to the NAACP? Now, I understand their slowness to react, unlike 20 years ago, is because they're stuck too. And that they don't want, they're
going through their own procedures. The Pennsylvania NAACP has actually pushed for his resignation, and we've seen articles about that recently. And the discussion is not over within the NAACP. I think that this is, it's not like this is, that this was a minor issue for them. There's no question that this is a major issue within the NAACP. But I'm going back to your column a little bit. And I came away, and we disagree on certain nuances, but I think on one point I thought you can't be serious, Jonathan, when you said that the Jewish community should now cut ties with the national team. Now, maybe you didn't use those words. Maybe I'm over-interpreting. But look, I may agree that we should that the NAACP has a responsibility to take that anti-Semitism much more seriously, even before it became an issue with this recent meme. And they should never have allowed somebody with those associations to continue to be represent them in any way, shape, or form. That said, that's the world we live in. And I still regard NAACP as a thoughtful, moderate organization doing good work, trying to make the world a better place, that does take anti-Semitism, generally speaking, seriously, and even in this case takes it seriously, might not do what we want them to do. How are we supposed to, what are we supposed to do in the end? Do you really believe that cutting ties or sending some kind of message in no uncertain terms is the right thing to do?
I think we need strong, number one, I think let me rack is saying, I think we're entitled to get more than we've gotten from them, number one. The weeks of delay, which was confusing, as I said, to local African-American members of the community who are not happy about this. It's not like everybody in the African-American community is cheering Rodney Mohammed. There are faith leaders who are outraged, but they're in essence powerless, and they weren't empowered by their national leaders, to whom they had a right to expect leadership. The NAACP has failed, so far on this. And indeed, the reports that the CEO and president and CEO of the NAACP, whom was on your webinar recently, that he is meeting with Rodney Mohammed, and he's going to be holding other meetings with him. It had the feel of, I'm just trying to make this go away. I'm not trying to really solve this problem. And I think we have a right to be judgmental about that. And we have a right to say that. And we also have a right to say, you know what, until you fix this, we are going to view you, as a John Desai. You're absolutely right that the NAACP is the most venerable. It is a good partner in terms of the Jewish community. Whether you and I might agree with everything they might say, that's not the point. They are the people whom we would hope would be representing the interests of the African-American community, because their values are good. We really do share values with them. But if they fail this test, we have a right to say something about it. We have a right to draw judgment about it.
Right.
And quite frankly, to those Jews who are board members, national board members of the NAACP, my question to them, including someone who is, not just ordinary Jewish donors, but somebody like Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who's the head of the RAC, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. My question to him is, if you're going to let this go, and you're not going to,
I'm actually quite certain that he hasn't let it go, by the way. I'm actually quite certain, because I know Jonah very well, and Jonah takes anti-Semitism very seriously and is always.
Of course he does, but in the end, see, that's what I'm saying. I'm not questioning motives of the, motives, or that they're not good people at the NAACP or the people who are their partners. I'm saying you've been presented with a problem. It's a problem you probably didn't want. It's a problem that you have done your best to avoid dealing with, because people like Rodney Mohammed are no longer outliers. They have a lot more pull. And this is also taking, we just as we know that the Jewish world is you have to judge us in the context of the Jewish world and what goes on in the Jewish world. In the summer of the Black Lives Matter movement, the NAACP has less, it's no longer the go-to voice in terms of the national media. They are in a difficult position. They want to reassert themselves, I'm sure. And the last thing they want is to get into an internecine war with members of their own community and be accused by people on the far left or the radicals of being sellouts. And yet, I still have to say, with all the goodwill in the world, that the fact that a month, several weeks after he made this Facebook post, that he's still there, that there has been no, it's been allowed to fester, and that not only I am far from sure that they're going to solve it, their members of the African American community are far from certain that it's going to be solved.
Right.
That is something about which we are entitled to have an opinion and to draw judgments. And among those judgments might be to say, you know what, we're going to cool it for a while until you figure this out. Because if we don't, then we are sending a signal. And we worry about this all the time. What signals are we sending, just as they do? Is that if we are not going to be judgmental about it, then we're sending the wrong signal too.
Right. You have a couple champions on here who say I should let you speak and shouldn't cut you off. I just want to.
I'm worried that I'm not letting you speak.
No, it's okay. I'm a discussant here. I'm also an interviewer, but I'm also a discussant. So it's a bit of a different format. So we got a question here from one of the viewers. What are your short and longer term concerns about the progressive wing, progressives in quote here, of the Democratic Party, which is slowly gaining strength when individual members such as Ilhan Omar are openly, quote, anti-Semitic screed? We obviously saw Congresswoman Omar win her primary against a strong opponent. What is your view on that?
Okay, let's understand this, and again, pull back the lens a little bit. We have to understand that our two major political parties in this country have, over the last 50 or 60 years, basically exchanged personalities on the issue of Israel. A couple of generations ago, when we were kids or before that, the Republicans were a party that were largely divided on Israel. There were many Republicans who were either hostile or just indifferent, some who were ardent supporters. The Democratic Party was, by and large, a lockstep pro-Israel party. There was very little room in not none, but very little room in the Democratic Party for people who were anti-Zionist or had some kind of ideological, axe to grind against Israel and the Jews. In 2020, the opposite is now true. The Republicans, love them or hate them, are pretty much a lockstep pro-Israel party. There was one member of Congress in the Republican caucus who was hostile to Israel, Justin Amash in Michigan. He's no longer a Republican, so they can say they're unanimous now. They are ardently pro-Israel. It's motivated by the influence of the evangelical movement, which are very pro-Israel. It's also a lot of just basic philo-Semitism, and they're just friendly. And, in President Trump, again, love him or hate him, and most Jews are not big supporters of him. He's been very pro-Israel, whether you agree with his measures or not. The Democrats are divided. Now, I say divided. They are not the anti-Israel party. Let me make that clear. I'm not saying anything like that. And indeed, in terms of the presidential race, in a column that I was just published, last night after the selection of Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's running mate, the pro-Israel wing of the Democratic Party pretty much fished its wish in terms of the national ticket. Biden and Harris is the optimal that they could have done. So there are still many pro-Israel members of the Democratic Party, the leadership in Congress, people like Steny Hoyer, they're strongly pro-Israel. But the left wing, the progressive wing, if you will, of the Democratic Party is not ardently pro-Israel. Many of them buy into intersectional ideology, which wrongly claims that the Palestinian war against Israel is the moral equivalent of the struggle for civil rights in this country. Some of those who were organizing the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago put out a platform. They're anti-Israel, and certainly people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, the Squad, if you will. These are people who are basically hostile to Israel, and even people who are Jews like Bernie Sanders are strong critics of Israel. They're not anti-Israel, but they are basically, anytime Israel defends itself, they're jumping in to say it was too much, no matter what it was. So Democrats are no longer ardently pro-Israel. They're divided about Israel. And it is in that context that we're having these worries about the future, in that younger Democrats, if you look at the polls, and let me just say, we in the organized Jewish world and in Jewish journalism, we do a lot of Schreien Gewalt about things being terrible. Polls still show us that the vast majority of the American people are pro-Israel, are supporters of Israel.
Right.
The difference is
it's
that
an important point that you say that to some of to the right flank in the Jewish community as well.
But let me just explain in that if there is any division, it is bipartisan. In that Republicans they are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. Independents, vast majority pro-Israel. There is a sizable minority within the Democratic Party that is no longer identifying with Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians or deeply sympathetic to Israel. That is something that cannot be ignored. It can't be just saying, don't make Israel a campaign issue. We do need to have a right to hold politicians accountable, to speak up about this, and to the extent that, to the sort of people who are Jewish Republicans who are deeply critical of the Democratic Party right now, the point that they have, where they really have a leg to stand on, is not to say that the Democrats are uniformly anti-Israel, but that the leadership of the Democratic Party is not taking a strong stand against the anti-Israel members of their party. Nancy Pelosi endorsed Ilhan Omar. I mean, she picks winners. She was smart enough to know that Ilhan Omar was going to win that primary, no matter how much money her opponent raised. And there
is a growing left-wing contingent within the Democratic Party. There's no question about it.
So that's the reality.
Let me advance an alternative thesis here. I have a feeling, we're going to see an overwhelming majority of Jews vote for the Democratic candidate.
You're not going out on a limb there.
Yeah, exactly. I'm no Nate Silver here, but I can venture a guess. What that tells you is that still the overwhelming percentage of American Jews are less comfortable in the Republican Party than they are in the Democratic Party. I think, and I think the worry here that we're seeing is that many Jews, particularly Jews who care a lot about Israel, are worried that they don't find a home in the Republican Party, and that the Democratic Party over time could be inhospitable too. And they want to be able to be comfortable in the American political scene. They don't want to have happen to them what happened to Jews in the UK with the Labour Party. And it's exactly why I'm pushing back against this argument about engagement. That it's so important that Jews who care about progressive causes engage on progressive causes, are act in the circles that you may be problematizing in a way, and because they're trying to make sure that there's space for Jews there, that they don't give over those progressive causes to people who are hostile to them, and that we allow that process to happen. I don't want it to become so hard, because our right wing, quite honestly, makes it so hard for Jews who care, progressive Zionists especially, who care a lot about Israel, care a lot about fighting anti-Semitism, that they can't go into a room representing organizations like ours that might have some problematic people there and say, we're here to stand up for ourselves. We're here to make sure that the Women's March doesn't become a platform for anti-Israelism. And we're going to make sure that that our voices are heard in the mix. And I think that's why it's so important that we not make it too hard to engage. And that's really why I want us to be on an engagement footing. So
actually, you bringing up the Women's March actually proves both of our points, because of course you're right, and I'm not going to just sit here and quote myself, but as I've said, the fight to preserve the Democratic Party for the pro-Israel community is a fight that liberals must fight, not conservatives. Not me. I mean, I'll have my say about it, but in essence, this is
maybe you have your own battles on the right.
Right, exactly. So this is a battle. Of course, pro-Israel Democrats have to fight for their party. This is their obligation, because they need to have a political home. They are not going to become Republicans, let alone pro-Trump Republicans. They need to do that. They need to work hard. And my critique of them is not, well, you're liberals, you're bad. It's like, no enemies on the left. If you are not going to be, Ilhan Omar is not a problem for Republicans. Republicans love ironically, love the existence of Ilhan Omar, because it allows them to say it's Ilhan Omar's party. It's Rashida Tlaib's party. Just as liberals loved Steve King, the congressman from Iowa, white supremacist, language and ties, totally problematic. Republicans dealt with him belatedly, but when they finally got around to it, they did the right thing. He was shunned in Congress last year. He was all his committee appointments were taken away, and the Republican Party went all out to defeat him in his primary, and he was defeated this year. He's not coming back next year. Democrats didn't do that with Ilhan Omar, or at least not enough. Not enough of them. I cite Nancy Pelosi. That's an issue. But the point is, of course, I think liberals and progressive Jews, pro-Israel Jews, need to step up to the table wherever they're affiliated, wherever they have partners and friends. But when they do that, they have to speak up for Israel. They have to speak up against the anti-Zionists. They have to fight the good fight in those places. And the Women's March, which you cite, is a very apt example. And Women's March, is the anti-Trump. It's the progressive movement. It's the resistance. But when its leaders, people like Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour, were totally compromised by not merely anti-Zionism, which is anti-Semitism, which we both agree on, but by open anti-Semitism, then eventually, it didn't happen right away. It took some persuading, it took some realization, because partisanship is a very strong pull. People don't want to think ill of their political allies. It's true on the right, it's true on the left. Mm-hmm. But when it became plain, progressive Jewish organizations said enough, and they pulled out of the Women's March. They said, no, we're not going to be partners with Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory. We said, we're drawing the line in the sand. You guys are done or we're out. And then that happened. That was exactly the right thing to do. That was the right kind of engagement.
I think it was the right kind of engagement, but I think it was a culmination of also an inside game that had been going on a long time, where there are Jewish women's groups who are very much part of the Women's March movement, who are in active discussion with the Women's March leaders, not just the three organizers, but a large group of people who own the march as well. And that helped actually change as well. In other words, there's sometimes a good cop, bad cop dynamic that works in our favor. And I find it ironic that sometimes the good cop, in this case it's the insiders, the people who are trying to influence, want the bad cop to go away, even though the people who are yelling anti-Semitism are probably helping them. And the bad cop wants the good cop away for fear they're going to legitimize the anti-Semites, when actually they're making sure that there's credibility from within the movement. I believe that is a desirable dynamic. It's not one we necessarily choose in a strategy, but it just so happens that in this case, our diversity is our strength, in my view.
I think you make a very strong case for that. And there are instances, certainly in foreign policy, in Jewish history, we've seen that, and certainly in the struggle to create the state of Israel. It took both a Haganah and an Etzel to get the British out. I mean, which both sides didn't necessarily agree with, yet, with the perspective of history, we can understand that, that it took both diplomacy and and force to do it. And yes, that can replicate itself. My only worry is that within our organized Jewish community, sort of to use the language of that long ago Jewish struggle, the organized Jewish world, as I said, has this default belief in diplomacy. And the people on the outside, they're sort of the nudniks, they're the poshim, as we'd say in Hebrew, the dissidents, and they're very quiet. They don't have the pull that the organized community can have, and that's why sometimes we can create a dynamic where, as I said, the impulse to diplomacy becomes the only impulse, or the impulse to dialogue at any cost. And that's my message to the organized community world, to the community relations world, is always to be aware of that. I think there are responsible leaders like you who are aware of it, but I also know that there are plenty of people in the organized Jewish world, not necessarily the heads of JCRCs, but the heads of liberal or progressive groups, who don't understand the need for balance or for any wariness at all. And when their voices grow too loud, and when they are the truth is, as you noted, American Jews, the vast majority of American Jews, certainly the vast majority of non-Orthodox American Jews, are politically liberal and largely ardent Democrats. When that voice becomes the only voice, that is problematic. And that's why when we have issues, and again, I'm not that interested in celebrity conversions, but where we have institutional problems, we need to be aware of just, where the landmines are and not step on them, or certainly not step on them deliberately.
Right. My only, I'll just reply 1 minute and then maybe we'll wrap up. I would say that when groups like ours are trying to play that inside game and be in dialogue with people, it really feels like the full force of the Jewish community is in condemnation mode and not giving us a lot of slack. It doesn't feel like that's the dominant voice. And I'd be interested, the next time one of these controversies emerge like that, maybe the two of us can do this again and analyze it a bit.
That sounds like a really good idea.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and not just because there's some ideological or strategic differences here that we can sort of play on and actually find a lot of common ground, but because also there's a journalist and a professional dynamic that I think is also interesting to explore, where you come at this as a journalist, you can say whatever you want. I'm a professional representative. I can't, but still able to say a lot. And I'm glad we're able to play this out in a public way, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, let me just close by saying one thing, David. We have our disagreements, and people, I write daily for jns.org, and people disagree with me every day, and that's fine. My worry really isn't, my main worry about the Jewish community today isn't so much about who we're sitting down with, among the anti-Semites. It's our inability to sit down with each other. Our inability to find a common cause, which is, I know what JCRCs are all about, but is becoming increasingly difficult because, as I said, this bifurcated tribal nature of American politics, which has completely infected every corner of our society, and not least the Jewish community. We need to unite against, we need to find the grace, the ability to work together. Now, not at any cost, not meaning that we're going to compromise with anti-Zionists. I'm for a big tent, but not for a big tent. We have to stand for something. And if we are, if we stand for, only for inclusion, then we stand for nothing. But to the extent that we can all rally behind the idea that we want a state of Israel, we were against anti-Semitism, we were for the safety of the Jewish community, we have to put aside our political differences, left, right, and try and work together. Don't walk away from the Jewish table. Let's try and work together where we can, and read other things. If you're a left winger, you should read, JNS. If you're a right winger, you should read some of the left wing publications. Let's try and understand each other, try and listen to each other. When we do, we always find out that the things that unite us as Jews, just as is true for Americans, are stronger than our differences.
Amen. Well, I'm glad we had this dialogue, and I hope we were able to model that a bit today. Thank you all for being with us, and until next time, take care.